announcing the 1916 Company app, fully redesigned, available on the Apple App Store and Google Play, combining new watches from many brands with more being added all the time, and our traditionally vast collection of pre-owned luxury timepieces. A redesigned homepage, a natural departure point for trading, browsing our inventory, and checking out our studio originals. Build your online wish list, a virtual collection that allows you to leverage all of the makes, models, and reference numbers in our databases. And seamless trading. Contact your advisor, forward pictures, get an estimate, and choose your next match from our vast online inventory. All of this on the 1916 Company app, available on Google Play and the Apple App Store.
I am Tim Masso of the 1916 Company here with George Mayer, and it strikes me that there are some oddities in the world of collecting. People collect things they can't use. If you collect exotic sneakers, rare sneakers, scotch, wine, you can have it, but you can't enjoy it, because the second you enjoy it, it ceases to be collectible, which is why I think it's great to have a collectible that you can actually enjoy. And your boss and mine, Danny Govberg, once proved how much you can enjoy the Journe line sport watches by jumping into his pool wearing one. My eyes watered and the hair on my spine rose, but the watch was fine. And I think that just goes to show why these watches are fun. You can both collect them and enjoy them. So George, you're both a Journe owner and a longtime advocate for the brand. Back in 2011, how special was the original line sport in aluminum as an inside-out aluminum execution?
Well, I think FP was way ahead of his time on that watch, as he oftentimes has been. I don't know of any other fully aluminum watch at that point. Aluminum movement, aluminum case, aluminum bracelet. We just weighed it, and it weighed in at, what was it?
No kidding. Aluminum Centigraphe Sport full bracelet, 55.2 grams. And you're absolutely right. In the wristwatch world, this was the first inside-out aluminum watch. Now, Vacheron, from the 30s through the 50s, actually made an all aluminum pocket watch, but that doesn't count because you can't wear and enjoy that. You definitely can't swim with it. This watch was just an absolute, I guess, a unicorn at the time, because it was something Journe envisioned as an innovation and a lot of fun, but no one was asking for it. And that kind of leads into the rarity of these. But let's dispel a myth right now. We've got titanium, we've got aluminum on the table. People think the aluminum is scarcer. It's actually the titanium.
That's correct. So a total of 750 42 millimeter Journe sports watches were ever made.
That's aluminum and titanium.
Aluminum and titanium combined. So there, to break it down, there were 188 aluminum Centigraphs, and that's between both the aluminum bracelet version and the rubber strap version combined, 188. There were then 316 aluminum Octa Sports. And that is a combination of both aluminum Octa Sport on an aluminum bracelet, like we have here, an aluminum Octa Sport on a rubber strap, which this weighed in at 53 grams to give people an idea of just how light the watch is. And I'll never, ever forget, I remember it so vividly, the first time I ever held an aluminum Centigraph. And I went like this to make sure it wasn't, it's just feather light, and you're amazed that it's an actual, like, tangible item.
Yeah, I mean, it's a shocking thing because, and I'm going to say that it was more RM that capitalized on this. The idea that with a luxury product that less is more, it can be unnerving when you've been told your whole life, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, that the heavier a watch is, the more precious it is and the more valuable. This watch that was almost like a second skin, that was so freakishly light, you'd shoot panicked glances at your wrist to check that it's still there. I think people didn't latch on to it immediately, and that kind of explains the rarity of these.
Correct. So just to finish off on the aluminum Octa Sport, they made 316 total. That's between the aluminum bracelet version, the rubber strap version, and then he made 99 of the black aluminum version, combination of some had the Indy 500 on the dial and some did not. And then serial 0 is with FP in Geneva. So 100 of the black aluminum, 216 of the gray aluminum, combination of both aluminum bracelet and the rubber strap. And then only 246 of the titanium 42 millimeter Journe sports watches, 174 of the titanium Octa Sport, and 72 of the titanium Centigraphe. People don't realize that how few there of the titanium Centigraphe and 42 millimeters there are, and that it's actually the rarest of all of the different 42 millimeter variations.
Yeah, and it's really striking to think that all of the titanium sports watches in 42 amount to basically 2 years of chronometre bleu production. Now, the other nice thing about them is that the aluminum movement required all sorts of new tooling and technology and investment to actually produce bridges and plates in that material. And that's uniform for both the full aluminum and the titanium external. I think it's also important to dispel some of the myths surrounding the aluminum models. I think there's this belief that they degraded or they decomposed. There's
corroded.
Some material reason for discontinuing them. Maybe that was a concern, but I think the bigger concern was just that it was a very expensive way to make a case and bracelet.
Right. So I believe one person in particular had an experience where the watch started to pit and corrode on his wrist. And it could have just been that person's skin composition, whatever it may be. You and I were talking just before, going live now about how very few of the aluminum pieces show significant signs of wear and permanent damage. And I think, some people are concerned about the aluminum pieces and because it's known that they transitioned from aluminum to titanium because of that particular reason. But again, I think there were more factors at play as to why you switched over.
Yeah, I've got 3 watches on the table here, all aluminum bracelet clasp. These are watches that have stood the test of time. I think there are always going to be people with bizarre body chemistries. I've heard rumors of, sterling silver watches turning wrists blue. I've never seen it myself. But this is one of those cases where I think the myth exceeds reality. And these watches have proved to be very, very stable. Now, I do think there was a cost issue for Journe making these cases and bracelets, which was probably the #1 motivation to go over to titanium. The titanium has a different look. Whenever you see the shaded gray, this anthracite, you're always looking at titanium Journe. I will say one thing, all watches of this generation featured the rubber bumpers, which I actually like because I'm all about durability, and I find that they do hold up really well. They don't vulcanize, they don't crack, they don't peel, and they do tend to preserve the finish. And particularly as a tonal contrast, I really like them for the complementary qualities.
Something else too, we say 42 millimeter over and over again. You cannot cross-reference brands when it comes to case sizes. There's a million examples that can be provided to support that. But something that's interesting about Journe sports models, they don't have lugs. So they actually fit a wide range of wrist sizes because of that. The bracelet can stretch out or it can, hug the wrist.
I'm happy to be the wrist model for this. Yeah, now here's the thing. I've got a reputation as not being a Journe guy, but I'm also not a Breguet guy, but my God, do I respect the man. These watches are a hell of a lot of fun, and Journe always does things primarily for himself, which is kind of a sign of integrity because you're not commercially oriented. The aluminum watch, the titanium watch, building it inside out of lightweight materials, maybe that's not what the market was asking for back in the early 2010s. I think we were coming out of the bigger is better era of the 2000s, and that was the direction a lot of watches were going. 48 millimeter Hublot King Power, 44 millimeter Royal Oak Offshore. This kind of lugless 42 millimeter watch that's also thin, that's also feather light, was not what the market was asking for at the time, which is probably one of the reasons, like Blade Runner, it's not what, theater goers were asking for, but God, has it aged well. These watches have stood up really well. They wear great. And frankly, I think this idea of integrating a bracelet to the case back in 2011, that's something else no one was asking for back then that looks really contemporary right now. I don't look at that watch and say, oh, blue dials, that's 2015, or giant cases, that's 2009. I think the fact that Journe is an auteur, he's like Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys or John Lennon. You hear the music, you immediately recognize the author. That's kind of the way it is with the watches, and that's why, even though I've never been like a Journe fanboy, I have huge respect for someone who goes his own way. Everyone else be damned.
Right. And we talk about timing, and I mentioned how I think he was ahead of his time when he came out with these aluminum pieces. You and I were discussing Journe is a premier brand, arguably the premier independent in today's watch world. if you were to look at the other powerhouse brands in the market today, if those brands were to come out with a 188-piece limited edition, 100th of a second, fully aluminum watch on an aluminum bracelet, the retail price on that watch would probably be at least $500,000. And by the way, it would be swarmed. So it's interesting. I think that the Journe sports watches have kind of been a victim of the brand's success. When you think Journe, I think the first thing that people think of is a precious metal strap watch.
I would even say this, that when people think of Journe, they think of dress watches.
Correct, yes. I think platinum or rose gold leather strap watch, whether it be a Resonance, a Tourbillon, a CS. And so I think that because of that, these sports watches have been overshadowed, and they still are today.
Yeah, and I think it's always kind of a tendency of people to want what they can't have anymore. They can't have the 42 millimeter case anymore. They can't have the 38 millimeter case anymore. What happens? Everyone wants those. And at this point, it became very, very difficult, even with our resources, and we are known as kind of a source for Journe. It became very, very difficult to get these 5 watches together. I think we had to bring them in from other locations around the world. So what you're looking at here is actually a pretty rare sight, and this is pretty much the limit of what can be assembled. So if you're not going to see more than 5 of them together here at the 1916 company, rest assured you will never see them at your watch club or Red Bar. So there is that element of exclusivity, but also the integrity that comes with a brand that you know is going to be around to take care of the thing. There's something reassuring about Journe's permanence. 1999 is not a long time ago in the context of this industry, but it is an absolute eternity in the world of independent brands.
A thought I just had of a watch that's very cool. FP's been spotted wearing it. He has a aluminum Centigraphe with a yellow dial. So the yellow dials only came into play on the current 44 millimeter. And so FP, obviously he can do it. He put a yellow dial on a aluminum Centigraphe, and it is ridiculously cool. Something you won't see anywhere else aside from on his wrist, I imagine. So it's cool seeing how the sports model family has evolved. And so you talked about how all of these have rubber bumpers. Now a lot of in fact, the titanium Octa Sport or Centigraphs have solid titanium bracelets. They got rid of the rubber bumpers on those. I think people are probably split. I talk about it all the time. It's funny, bumpers, no bumpers. I think it's right down the middle.
I think it's going to be more in favor of bumpers over time for the same reason that it's more in favor of 38 millimeter cases and 42 millimeter cases and brass movement models. All the stuff that people weren't that excited about at the time, when it becomes rare and you can't get it anymore, then everyone wants it. So this is an interesting collection of watches, and the great thing is, to an extent, this is just down to taste, because the aluminum is maybe more unusual, but the titanium is also more exclusive, which is not the way people think about it. People think, oh, titanium, that was for the sake of mass production, but it didn't work out that way. If that was the plan, they failed, because there's a lot fewer of these hanging out. Now, I'll also say this. We talk a lot about the materials, but from a technical standpoint, they're all significant. Take the Centigraphe GPHG Aiguido, 1/100th of a second chronograph. Fundamentally, it's a 3 hertz escapement, but it's also got a secondary escapement that steps up to 50 hertz. And an exclusive on the sport model is you can actually see that secondary escapement through the Foudroyant dial. Now, on the standard Centigraphe dress watch, it's a solid dial with the tachymeter. Journe seemed to understand that no one was going to time a rocket ship going 36,000 kilometers per hour. Opening up the heart of each one of these little dials opens up your view into the movement, which is a big part of what attracts you to an Aiguido winning watch.
I deal with many of the biggest Journe collectors in the world, and one in particular who has close to 100 pieces and many of the best that FP has ever made, told me if he could only have 5, the aluminum Centigraphe would make the cut. He thinks it's extremely historically significant.
Exactly, and I think what you're saying is the patent on the barrel allows the watch to run its chronograph without losing balance amplitude. With two separate drivetrains off the barrel, one from the arbor and one from the barrel itself, you lose power reserve, but you also maintain balance amplitude, and that's one of only a handful of watches in the world that can do that. So yeah, 2 patents and very chrono-specific too.
Right, and then also his first sports watch. That version was the aluminum Centigraphe was the first iteration of any sports model that he ever made. So very, very significant for the brand and one of the greatest watchmakers of our time.
I want to talk about integrity because I think there's a spectrum. There's this whole idea that if you are successful commercially, you don't have integrity. And I think maybe on one end you've got Ludovic Baloise making his 12 watches a year out of his house. And then on the other end, you've got what Franck Muller was back in the 90s, where you've got mass production of watches with your name, but they're all ETA movement powered. So with Journe, he's managed to get up to, I'd say, just about under 1,000 mechanical watches a year, but while maintaining creative control, creative direction, that auteur quality where each watch feels like a product of his mind and not a committee or a corporate overlord. And even in bringing in Chanel ownership, it's a minority stake. And I don't think there are too many brands in the space that do such a good job of combining commercial success and recognition with integrity as a creative manufacturer. I think that's also part of Journe. And that kind of brings us to the next point I wanted to broach, which is these are all collectible because they're discontinued and they're rare. But very, very soon, Mr. Journe is going to move on to the next phase of his career, which most likely is going to be education as a teacher for master classes. He's been talking about doing this for at least a decade. He has very few innovations that he has put on his personal roadmap that he hasn't already achieved. So unless he wants to do a dive watch or a pilot's watch, he is awfully close to turning the page to becoming essentially watchmaker emeritus at Montre-Journe. There are other watchmakers, there are other engineers, there are replacements, so to speak, waiting in the wing. But this is like Ferrari during Enzo's lifetime and then what comes after. And the best Ferraris to own from a collectible standpoint are the ones made before the big man died.
Right.
And these are very much those watches. Journe's not dying anytime soon. He was born in the late 50s. But my point is, very soon you're going to see Journe watches that are at least partly a product of someone else's imagination, and these are always going to be FP.
Mm-hmm. And FP is made, despite his super small annual production of 1,000 pieces or less, oftentimes, for many years, 500 to 600 pieces, he's made a ton of different models inside that, small overall production.
It's highly segmented.
Right, exactly. So that's part of the reason why these sports models, one, they're so rare, only 750 of them in total, and they're oftentimes overlooked just because he's made so many incredible, iconic models that you think of when you think FP Journe, that this isn't necessary, these watches aren't necessarily the first that you think of, but they're very special. Again, super ahead of his time. If other brands were to do it, I think now, given the way the market is, it would be like an earthquake. So it's funny to see how they've settled in, and this is why you and I figured it would be cool to do a couple Journe Sport segments, just because there's very little attention. Journe's a powerhouse brand. Sports models, beach to tux models have been all the rage ever since COVID. People want watches that you can wear, anytime, any place, in any setting. And so you would think that a powerhouse brand and their awesome, unique sports models would be incredibly popular. And from a relative standpoint, they're actually probably the slowest movers and the best bargains out of the entire Journe production.
There's definitely an opportunity here. I think it's ironic that Journe's cheapest watch ever is also his best known sports watch, and that's the Elegant 48. When people think of a Journe sports watch these days, they mostly think of that, because it's lightweight, it's heavily loomed, it's titanium, it's almost always on a rubber strap, it's very water resistant, but there is no real cap on the Elegant. Even on a yearly basis, they're counted separate from the mechanical pieces.
Right.
Within the mechanical production historically from 2011 to 2018, you had the sports watches. Within the sports watches, you had that split between bracelets and straps. And then you also had the split between the Octa Automatic Reserve de Manche and the Centigraphe. So like you said, it's almost like classic Ettore Bugatti era Bugattis. You know these things and they're legendary, and you assume that there must have been lots of them, but then you look at the individual models and you're like, there's no more than a few dozen of any of these. And that is kind of the appeal of these. You're inside a well-established brand that's not going anywhere commercially. They're not going to disappear. They're not going to dissolve. They're not going to perish with the departure of the founder. There's always going to be money for parts and service. But at the same time, you do get that sort of rarity that you normally get only with really tiny, like one-horse operations. And that's not universal to all Journe watches, but it's definitely the case with the sports watches because they are so partitioned, segmented, and uncommon. And I'm also going to throw this out. The aluminum movements, they look really cool. It's a tough thing to finish aluminum in any fashion other than the most industrial, which is why, if, for example, the old Bulgari aluminum was just an exterior job. They have an incredible look to them. They're really cool. They're really tech-oriented, and this is a watch that could satisfy almost everyone, the aesthete, the contrarian, the collector, and the technologist. And I would also go so far as to say that this is probably the perfect watch for like a tech guy. If you're working in Silicon Valley, you know, maybe you're involved with software, maybe you're involved with hardware, but overwhelmingly you have this sense of impermanence. And there's something deeply appealing about innovation that goes the distance. And that's the great thing about watches. These were all innovative. I don't want to put too fine a point on it, but these are watches that were designed to be used, can continue to be used, and yet give you all of the collector value of something really, really rare. One scratch is not going to be your undoing. You're not going to worry if you rub a bumper off the bracelet because it can always be replaced. Parts are available. And these are not things that need to sit in a vitrine or a winder for their entire existence. And, you know, Danny Govberg's your proof right there. That well-worn, I think it's a Centigraphe Sport that he wears?
Yes. 3-part series is on my Instagram. It's Mayor Time. If you haven't seen them, I highly recommend you check them out. You'll be very entertained.
And I'm just going to say this too. Little details surprise and delight. The unique rotor on the Octa Sport. That rotor is only on the line sport models. The fact that the luminescent applications are solid blocks of lume. They're not printed on the dial. They are solid blocks. The fact that the dials themselves are made of aluminum, that there's all sorts of little nods and winks, things that are fun and frivolous and unnecessary but cool because of it, like the smoked sapphire sub-seconds, or the fact that the bezel for the sub-seconds is media blasted, or the fact that the numerals on the double-digit date are bright signal red. They're just a lot of fun and kind of FP Journe at his most playful. We all know that Journe can be a really serious guy and sometimes a bit of a grump, but I think kind of like the captive spirit of the man finds its release in these sport models, even more than the dress pieces.
Yeah, 2 thoughts I had while you were talking. If you're in a warm climate and you want a bracelet watch, you should look at these for sure. I mean, it's tough to beat a bracelet watch. You know, if you're in 100-degree heat, these still work. And then titanium generally is very easy to scratch. These, not so much. You know, they're coated in a way where it's actually quite difficult to scratch.
Yeah, the application there is extremely hard. You know, people think, oh, PVD is PVD. No, PVD is physical vapor deposition. It's a process. The material that actually goes on can be anything from cheapo to diamond-like carbon, and this is an extremely resilient coating. So no real concerns there. If you want, you can put it on the strap. That's always a possibility. The option exists. They're readily available. But again, you have options, they're usable, and I'm going to throw this out there. Journe can be incredibly impractical with the sports watches, and a great example of that is the Indy 500. You mentioned it a bit earlier. We don't have one on the table because they're very rare. There's only 99. They made this watch essentially at the tail end of Jean Alesi's career as a race car driver for his tilt at the Indy 500 in 2012. Not because he was a dominant driver, not because he was on a dominant team, not because he was the obvious winner, but because he was another Frenchman and FP's personal friend. So he got his own commemorative model. Black aluminum, very cool, and 29 of the 99 had this triple signature with the Indy 500, Lotus, and Alesi. And again, 29 of the 99 had the signatures. No one wanted the signatures at the time. It's another example of how, in hindsight, we all wish we had the one that no one wanted. And it's not to say no one wanted these, just they were too far ahead of their time. These were visionary products. They're out of production as you see them here. Some are still available, but they're few and far between. So George, I guess just pick one on the table. Which is your favorite? You're a longtime Journe owner. What would you buy? What would you keep?
Oh man. I would probably, if I could only have one, I would probably go with the aluminum Octa Sport. I think I'd rather have a self-winding piece. I love the asymmetric dial, and you get the AM PM indicator, the date, and the power reserve. I could easily rationalize. I mean, I think the right answer is probably the aluminum Centigraphe, but for whatever reason, just me personally, if I could only have one, for whatever reason, I would probably take the aluminum Octa Sport.
You know what, I'm gonna second that, but I'm a car guy, so I'm gonna go with the Journe Lacey, and because nothing is sacred to me, I would want the one with all of the logos. I mean, I think it's kind of corny, but it's also fun because he did that for a friend. And
right, because it's not something he normally does. He's usually, like you say, he's not very commercial, not into
Can you imagine if he were commercial, how many Ferrari dialed Centigraphs he could sell?
Right.
And versus how many were made? So again, there's kind of an impracticality to Journe's mind, but that's the great thing about being creatively oriented before you're commercially oriented, and all those watches embody that. Again, I keep saying I'm not a Journe guy, but if you go on our reviews channel, you'll find more hands-on Journe reviews than anyone in history has ever done. So if you want to do a little bit of research on these pieces and see a little bit more information, particularly from an ergonomic and a technical standpoint, check out the 1916 Company reviews on YouTube. Time out, Tim out, George out, Journe out. Thanks for logging on.